Hi everyone, my name is Ali Iqbal. I am a Microsoft Azure Solution Architect and .NET developer with 7 plus years of experience. In today's video, I will provide you .NET 7 overview and what's new in it. So let's start. A few years ago, more specifically in 2016, Microsoft released .NET Core 1.0, a radical new version of .NET. Before .NET Core 1.0, we had the .NET framework which was initially released in the early 2000s, and it was Windows only and mostly closed source. .NET Core was the first version of .NET which runs cross-platform and is created out in the open on GitHub as an open source project. Microsoft released quite a few versions of .NET Core at a quite high pace. .NET Core 1.1, 2.0, 2.1 and 2.2. At that time, lots of things were changing in between releases still. Although the version number were not always logical, Microsoft released 3.0 and shortly thereafter 3.1 in 2019. 3.1 became what is known as an LTS version, short for long-term support version. Microsoft provided support for this version until December 2022. .NET Core 3.1 was a very commonly used version mostly because of its LTS status. Many organizations kept their software running on this version for quite a long time. At the end of 2020, Microsoft released version 5.0, which is already out of support. And no, I did not make a mistake, we went straight from 3.1 to 5.0. Version number 4 was skipped, mostly to avoid confusion with the .NET framework, of which 4x version exists. Now .NET 5 was so-called current release, meaning it also had just a shorter support cycle, which already ended in May 2022, just 1 year later. Microsoft released .NET 6 again an LTS version. .NET 6 was a big release, with new technologies being added and existing ones greatly expanded. It was frankly a lot of work for developers to learn all the new stuff which came with .NET 6. Apart from new features, it also the version where the unification of the different .NET platforms finally became a reality, although it had started with .NET 5. And again, a year later, in November 2022, Microsoft released .NET 7. I have put here now that this is now an STS release, a standard term support version. Again, more on that later. So, although we talked about .NET, there are, or maybe I should say, were in fact three .NET platforms. We had the original .NET framework, we have the Xamarin Stack, and we have .NET Core. Each of these is a silo, a vertical stack really, and they all have their own BCL or base class library. The BCL is the library containing many thousands of classes which you use all the time when creating applications. Although these libraries are very similar, they are not identical and thus at least initially we could not share code between these silos. That however has been one of Microsoft's long-standing dreams, allow developers to write code once and run it on multiple platforms. But because we have these different .NET platforms, that was not possible. Now Microsoft has been working to give developers the ability to share code, and the most commonly used approach to allow us to share code between these different platforms is or was .NET Standard. .NET Standard has been around for quite some time, basically allowing us to create a library in which we write our code and that can then be referenced from different .NET platforms. Microsoft guarantees that all that you write in there is understood by the different platforms. Now this is of course non-UI code, as you cannot share UI code between a mobile Xamarin application and a web application built with ASP.NET Core. Nevertheless, .NET Standard has been the way to share .NET code for quite a few years. The amount of code that we can put in there has grown substantially, meaning that we can share nearly all non-UI code using .NET Standard. Now, starting with .NET 5, mostly with .NET 6, Microsoft took things a step further. The different .NET platforms have now been unified. We will not say .NET Core or .NET Framework anymore. All there is .NET 7, one .NET going forward. It is the same .NET that you will be using to build all type of apps now, from desktop apps to cloud apps, web apps, games with Unity, mobile apps and artificial intelligence apps. The amount of code that you can share is now pretty much at its maximum, allowing you to share pretty much everything. And on top of this shared .NET, you will have specific libraries that you can bring in to add specific functionalities, such as, for example, when you are building a mobile app, but underneath they are all running on the same .NET. So we are really seeing that the different .NET platforms have come together. In fact, this unification process already started with .NET 5 and is now complete. For us as .NET developers, it means that we now have a single SDK and single BCL, no different .NET platforms, no different VCLs. All is based on the same foundation. As developers, you select the workloads you want to use to build your apps, be that a mobile app, a web app, you name it. You can share code between these different apps. On top of that shared code, you build the actual app, and there too more code can be shared. If you want to build native apps that run on many platforms, look at MAUI. Or if you want to build a rich web UI that also runs on multiple platforms, even on the desktop, you can look at using Blazor. All of these platforms now run on the same unified .NET. .NET 7, as is said, a smaller release compared to .NET 6. Although there are many changes, it definitely feels more as if Microsoft completed what they started with .NET 6 and is polishing things now. One of the main areas we can see this is in the performance department. All throughout the framework and the different SDKs, many performance improvements were made, making .NET 7 the fastest .NET so far. Maybe the free performance boost your application will get when you update them to .NET 7 is the most important reason to actually do that update already. Apart from these general improvements in performance, Microsoft also invested quite a bit in optimizing ARM64. ARM is a synonym for CPU power efficiency, giving us good to great performance with lower power consumption. I will not go into the specifics here, but know that the goal of giving .NET applications the same performance on ARM64 as on x64 is now much closer. Also, a lot of work to improve native AOT has been done. Basically, native AOT, short for ahead of time compile, takes out the JIT, the just in time compilation process, resulting in better performance too. And finally, performance improvements can be expected due to something called on-stack replacement or OSR. Throughout this OSR process, the runtime can change the code executed by currently running methods in the middle of the method execution. Although those methods are active on stack, if a method which is JITed is often called through OSR, the execution can jump to a more optimized version, resulting again in better performance. Along with .NET 7, a new version of C# is included. As always, the changes made are new features. They do not break existing code, but they can make it easier though. Some of the new features which are included are raw string literals, generic math, and support for more patterns. .NET has always had a huge library for us to use, and with .NET 7, some new APIs have been introduced here too. One of the most notable changes is probably adding microseconds and nanoseconds to datetime and siblings. Notable changes were also made to classes in the Microsoft.extensions.caching namespace, and support for working with tar files was also included. Also, quite a few new options were added to system.text.json. If you ask me, where did most changes happen? Which application framework got the most additions? I did be quick to say ASP.NET Core. ASP.NET Core has been growing over the past couple of iterations of .NET and .NET Core, and that has not changed with .NET 7. When we break it down, there have been changes to the core framework, additions in fact, and quite some nice ones too if you ask me. Rate limiting has been added, which allows any ASP.NET Core application to limit the rate of requests it will handle, for example in a given amount of time. Also, output caching has been added, which is a new way to configure how the responses from our ASP.NET Core app will be cached. If look at the well-established framework and then I refer to ASP.NET MVC and Razor pages, there have been some minor changes to this. However, minimal APIs which were introduced with .NET 6 as a new way to create APIs with all the ceremony of controls and the like have now seen quite a few extensions. These include endpoint filters, typed results, and route groups. Finally, Blazor got, in my opinion, again the biggest changes. Data binding feature were extended, new options to work with navigations and location changes, and a built-in data grid is also now available. .NET MAUI was introduced earlier in 2022 as a successor to Xamarin and mostly Xamarin.Forms that allows us to build mobile apps targeting iOS and Android, but we can also target the Windows desktop and Mac desktop using this technology. MAUI has received several updates since its release, but with the .NET 7 updates, there are some common themes that Microsoft has focused on. Performance is again one of the key improvement areas. Performance in general was improved, but also things like scrolling in the collection view, so the list control in MAUI is really a lot faster now. As said, using MAUI we can also target the desktop. With the earlier release, some things were still missing or were not perfect yet. In this area, Microsoft also improved things quite a bit. Tooltips, context menus, right click and more were added or improved. Also, MAUI got some new controls including the map control, and last but not least, Blazor Hybrid is now fully supported too. With Blazor Hybrid, we can as developers reuse our Blazor application code inside the MAUI app, and that will run natively. The latter opens up more options than traditionally supported in the WebAssembly context. If you have been or are looking at building a distributed cloud-ready application with ASP.NET Core, you will be happy to see that Microsoft is bringing Orleans into .NET as part of .NET 7. Previously, Orleans have not seen a lot of love from Microsoft, but now it has been integrated into .NET, meaning it will receive more frequent updates going forward. Orleans also got a lot of performance improvements, and its NuGet packages have also been made somewhat simpler in the structure. Not only the frameworks have been improved, but the tooling also too got some interesting upgrades. From day zero, Azure Platform as a Services such as Azure Functions, App Services and more got .NET 7 support, so no more waiting to publish your .NET 7 apps to Azure. Also, with this release, we got improved container support. Containers are gaining more and more attraction, but it's always some extra work that needs to be done to work with containers. It is now possible to create a containerized version of an application using .NET Publish, so using the SDK. Another feature where improvements were made is hot reload. Hot reload was introduced with Visual Studio 2022 and .NET 6 and allows in some cases to make changes to the source code while the app is running in debug mode, therefore shortening the build run debug cycle. Finally, the CLI got some improvements too, including tab completion of template options and arguments as well as help with altering templates. As developers, we did all love to be on the latest version. We always do. Sometimes that conflicts with company interest and your project may be well a bit behind and not everyone is already on .NET 6, for which the update to .NET 7 is very easy. For all those projects that are a bit behind, Microsoft has released an improved version of the Upgrade Assistant. This tool will help you upgrading and migrating your apps to .NET 6 and .NET 7. It will give you insights in what still works and what will not. And in some cases, it can do the migration for you. For the Upgrade Assistant, You do not need to start from .NET Core application. You can even have it start from an older .NET Framework app. It's definitely not perfect. Certainly, if you are an older version of .NET and the application is large, but it may be of help, so it's worth checking out. .NET 7 is what is known as an SDS release, short for Standard Term Support. This means that the support cycle for this version is shorter compared to an LTS release. It will only receive security updates for 6 months after the release of the next version, which will be .NET 8. That means that you will need to move your application if you deploy it to production with .NET 7, that is to the next version, well, pretty quickly. It should not be an issue as most updates to the next version are pretty easy. What this does not mean, however, is that .NET 7 is not production ready. Far from it. Technically, nothing should be stopping you to move your application to the next version. The only thing to keep in mind is that you will need to move it to a newer version well quicker. .NET 6 is an LTS release, short for long-term support version, meaning that it will receive updates for a 3-year period after the next version release. Some companies use a strategy where they will only run production apps on LTS versions, and in general, this is not a bad idea. Talking about the future and the next version, what is currently known is that .NET 8 will be, quite logically, the successor of .NET 7. The plan is to have .NET 8 to be released 1 year after .NET 7, so we are looking at November 2023 for it to be released, with preview and release candidates already coming out. Thanks for watching the video. If you found it helpful, please don't forget to subscribe my channel and share with others. I hope to see you in my next video. Thank you.